Hi, I'm Arif Fahruddin, and welcome to Asian Agribiz Podcast, bringing you interviews and update from the animal protein community throughout Asia from a trusted and dedicated provider of news, information, and market intelligence. In this series, Payungsak Wiryabunditku is speaking with Tony Edwards about alternative feed ingredients in poultry diets. Tony Edwards is a feed grain technical consultant, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre.
Hi, Tony. Thank you again for joining in this second podcast interview.
Good morning, Payungsak. Very good. Happy to be back.
Okay, Tony. In the previous podcast, you said that amid high ingredient prices, there's a big push for exploring alternative feedstuff to contain the cost of feeds. And you mentioned the benefits of barley and wheat, which attract a lot of interest from producers in Southeast Asia. Also, in the previous interview, we focused on pig. You said pig is really adaptable and it can utilize a wide range of feedstuff effectively. So it doesn't need to be just corn and soy based, as feed formulation is more about nutrients delivery than ingredient use. So, Mr. Tony, is this principle the same for poultry?
Yes, it certainly is. Poultry are quite adaptable as well. They're not restricted to corn and soy. Corn and soy are the traditional stock feed ingredients around the world, but only because they're usually plentiful and competitively priced. And when they become either limited or the price accelerates, then we have to consider the options of looking at other alternatives. And certainly it's no great challenge to either poultry or pigs to consider other raw materials. At the end of the day, the corn is just the cereal base to the diet, and it can be replaced by many other different cereals quite effectively. Things like wheat, barley, sorghum, cassava, millet, triticale, rice. There's many alternatives there, as well as the milling offals also have similar nutritive value. Things like wheat bran, rice bran, hominy, DDGS or dried distillers grains and solubles. All these materials can effectively play a role as part of the grain base for the diets. On the protein side, with the soya, there are also a number of alternatives, things like canola, or it might be known as rapeseed in Asia, sunflower meal, meat meal, blood meal, poultry meal if it's available. There are many legumes that are very useful as well, things like peas and beans and lupins, chickpeas, lentils. These all have got great food value for both poultry and pigs. And in more recent times, we've seen the products come available like protein biomass products from amino acid manufacture. And these have been very helpful. The bacterial biomass produces a product that's about 60 to 70% protein, and it's very good quality protein. And these have become quite significant in terms of a protein source for these diets. And there's also other byproducts on the protein side, like corn gluten and things like that, that can also be used.
Yes, there are many, alternative raw material that you mentioned. So for poultry, have you seen increased use of this alternative raw material in countries in Southeast Asia?
It's just simply a comparison of the nutritive value of each of these products and their price as to whether or not they will come in. It may be that they are not competitive, and it may be even though the price of corn and soy has gone up, the cost of these other materials is of no great advantage, and therefore they're not probably worth considering. And in that instance, you would probably just stay with corn and soy and pay the extra. But it may be well worth considering utilizing some of these, if only as a partial replacement of the corn and soy, or if we do use other protein sources, it may well be that they have to be used in combination several different sources rather than just a single replacement of one for soy. But when it comes down to the benefits and limitations of these products, I think we need to recognize that each of these grains are quite different physically and chemically to corn. And as such, we just have to recognize those differences. For instance, if you take wheat, it's similar in energy, but it's higher in protein usually than corn. And it can be used quite freely in all poultry diets, as well as pig diets. And we just have to be aware that it does contain some non-starch polysaccharide fractions like arabinose islands, which aren't an issue in corn. But we can deal with those very effectively with the exogenous enzymes that are available today as food additives. And we can make up the shortfall of the animal's ability to secrete those enzymes by supplying them in the feed. The other issue with wheat and other alternative grains, of course, is that they don't contain any pigments. And so if the corn is being used as a source of pigments for skin color or shank color or yolk color or whatever, then that if you switch to the alternative grain, you will have to find that pigment from another source. Other materials like sorghum, can be used as well, and they're similar in energy and protein to corn and can be largely replaced almost directly, but we have to be aware that there are some aspects of sorghum as well. Tannins used to be an issue, but in more recent times, the varieties we have available are very low tannin, and so it's not considered a problem. They do have some palatability issues for pigs, and we may be a little bit more conservative of their use there. Certainly doesn't worry poultry, but it does have some pelletability, as in terms of how that pellets in the feed mill. The starch characteristics of sorghum are such that it doesn't pellet as well as say wheat, but and probably not even as good as corn, but it can be used as I say, a partial or full replacement for corn where it's economically feasible to do so. And the other grain-like component, I suppose, that could be used there is cassava, which is primarily just starch. It tends to be lower in energy a little than corn, and certainly lower in protein. But at the right price, it can be a very effective grain substitute. On the soy alternative front, we have things like canola and sunflower. Both of these are quite useful proteins, but they tend to be lower in protein content than soy, where soy is sort of 46 to 48%. We would tend to find canola more in the range of 33 to 40, depending on how it's processed. And similarly with sunflower, the protein level might be more 28 in the underhulled product and up to 38% in the dehulled product. But the protein quality within those materials is quite good. And so when we take into consideration the slight variations in composition, we can make very effective use of them as substitutes for soy if the price is right. Certainly today, with the full spectrum of synthetic amino acids available, we have a great deal more flexibility in making up the shortfalls in amino acid contribution by moving away from soy, which is a very well balanced, a good protein. As we move to alternatives, which may not be quite so well balanced, we can quickly recover the position using these synthetic amino acids to maintain balance. The legume fractions are very useful too, in as much that they're sort of could be considered part grain and part protein meal. They can, by putting these in the diet, we can actually replace some of the corn as much as some of the protein sources or soy sources. And they come in many forms, as I mentioned, peas and beans and lupins and chickpeas, etc. And they all have their own peculiar aspects, and some of them do contain some non-starch polysaccharide fractions that need to be dealt with by specific enzyme supplementation. But generally speaking, they are very well accepted by both poultry and pigs, and can be utilised reasonably freely. And finally, the other protein source, I guess, is meat meal and blood meal and poultry meal. These are the sort of animal byproducts, I guess, that are used. These have very good protein quality in the most part, although can be variable depending on the processing conditions. We just need to assure ourselves of that quality as we use it. But they also contribute things like calcium and phosphorus and a degree of oil or fat. And so they can make up a significant part of the diet and be very effective alternatives for soy.
What is the main difference between broiler and layer when it comes to alternative feed, Mr. Tony?
Okay, all right. Well, what we're finding is, of course, that the broiler feeds tend to be higher in amino acid content or protein content than layer diets, and therefore more dependent on the soy. And to some extent, it's a bit more challenging to find an alternative for soy in broiler diets than it is in layer or pig diets. And so, but it can be done, and it's just a question of attention to detail and marshalling the right materials. It's basically just an exercise in understanding what the energy and protein contribution is from those materials, and also the fiber aspects and the minerals and any anti-nutritional factors that are there. So considering them all, the broilers probably tend to be a little bit more sensitive in terms of their gut, and therefore we have to be a little bit more conservative and a bit more selective in which materials we choose to go into those diets. But in terms of using, say, wheat or sorghum as an alternative to corn, these can be used quite readily. There's very little corn used in broiler diets here in Australia. The diets are primarily wheat or sorghum based with some barley. And so the need to sort of consider anything else other than possibly some enzyme support is fairly straightforward. In terms of barley, though, we are a bit more limited. The young broiler chicken doesn't handle fiber as well as adult birds. And so we have to be a bit conservative with how much barley we would include in the broiler starter diet, for instance. But we can include up to 15% barley quite comfortably into those diets, and if necessary, just do a partial replacement of the corn with barley if that's the only alternative we have. But in terms of, but as the bird matures, of course, and it can tolerate the fiber better. And so in finishing diets for broilers, we might be quite comfortable with up to 30% barley. Layers, as adult birds, can accommodate it very readily, and we've run trials here with barley up to 50% inclusion in the diet with no consequence at all for production. So they can be very adaptable when it comes to the use of barley. And I think, again, there's an advantage in having some barley in a lot of these diets purely because of its fiber contribution. The fiber at a modest level is very positive towards gut health and very helpful in things like feather picking and other issues like that. So I believe that we were, very well off to have 10 or 15% barley in most of those broiler and layer diets as a just simply on its own merits as a positive factor. But certainly at the moment, price-wise, it's very competitive, and it would find its way in there quite readily. But we just need to recognize that it does have a few peculiar aspects, and in particular, the non-starch polysaccharide fractions, and we do need to be helpful and supportful in terms of providing xylanase and beta-glucanase enzymes to deal with these fractions, and of course to supply phytase enzymes in the diets to get full utilization of the phytate phosphorus that's in those materials.
You know, for broiler starter, broiler grower, and layer, I mean, you know, when mixing feed formulation, what do you recommend? And, you know, also about the ratio, Mr. Tony.
Okay, I think we've got quite a degree of flexibility here as to how much of these you use. And one of the principles I guess we need to recognize is that the birds don't appreciate a sudden change in the substrate that you're using. So if you're going to introduce barley, for instance, into the diet, you wouldn't go in at the full rate straight away. You would gradually change it over time. And so we would, what we have to be mindful of is that any change of substrate in the grain base in the diet is probably likely to create a challenge to the microbiome, and we need to try and minimize any major disturbance there and give it time to adapt to the new substrate. So in that instance, as I said, I think we could go in with up to 15% barley in starter and up to 30% barley in the grower and finisher diets for broilers. We would just possibly need to start at modest levels and build up to that gradually.
Okay, so my next question, Mr. Tony, why and how would it be viable for feed miller to look to the region for alternatives rather than traditional sources from the US and Europe?
Okay, well, yeah, I guess this is part of the current dilemma that we're facing. Not only are we seeing high prices for corn and soy, but there seems to be a lot of disruption in the world at the moment in terms of climatic changes and pressure in terms of international shipping, partly associated with the COVID episode that's causing the problems in the world. And so it's a question of where do we get these materials? If we need to look for an alternative, where should we look? Well, I think first of all, you would look in your own backyard, as it were, and utilize what other materials might be available within the countries themselves, but also then further just to look more into the near region rather than further away. And certainly, although Australia doesn't produce much in the way of corn and soy and can't do much in regard to supplying that, they do have a very substantial supply of other alternatives, and which are quite workable and very cost effective. So I think there's a value in them looking further into the region without having to go to Europe or the US. And in fact, there are issues elsewhere in the world, like in Russia at the moment, the crop has been downgraded. There's some doubt about what availability of grain there will be out of the Black Sea ports this season. This harvest in Europe apparently has been interrupted with a lot of wet weather, and there's some doubts about the quality of the grain that's coming out of there. The Chinese demand for materials has certainly driven the price of traditional materials, corn and soy, up. And so much of the European and North American exports will be directed there. And as a consequence, I think there's an opportunity for other people in Southeast Asia to consider alternative supply options. And in that instance, moving to somewhere else close in the region to be able to secure a good supply of effective materials, I think is a very good strategy. And Australia is really well positioned, both geographically and in terms of its current grain stocks, to service the Southeast Asian market quite well.
Yes, right now Australia, can produce enough this alternative raw material, to serve Southeast Asia and other country. But when the situation change, maybe China come back or another drought, would that change the equation for Australia?
Well, these things are always changing day by day, I guess, and who knows what will happen down the track. But certainly the marketing arrangements with China and Australia at the moment have been somewhat disturbed, and there's very little product being moved from Australia to China at the moment, which makes a lot of material available for other markets. Traditionally, we would produce between 8 and 12 million metric tons of barley a year in Australia and around about 25 million tons of wheat. So there's considerable volumes of these grains available for export from Australia. And currently, or in the last year or two, we've seen a lot of uptake, particularly of barley, into places like Vietnam and Thailand and the Philippines. And so I think that there's good opportunity to consider this. There's certainly been a traditional movement of wheat at times into places like Indonesia and Thailand as well when the market conditions were appropriate. But I think when China comes back, China will just be another option in the marketplace. They will have to compete with what other trading arrangements are in place for other Southeast Asian countries. So I wouldn't be too concerned that they will come in and disrupt the market and create a shortfall of materials. And in regard to things like drought, of course, well, there's not a lot we can do about that. When it happens, and the grain isn't here. And in that instance, the producers would have to look for materials from other sources, whether it comes from Europe or America or from the local Southeast Asian production. But generally speaking, the crop this year in Australia was very good. It was a near record crop. And so we're holding very good stocks at the moment and can therefore assure supply well into next year from that. And also the next crop coming is looking very good. And so we should have another sound year. So I expect that in terms of the capacity to service the market, the situation from Australia looks very positive for at least the next 18 months.
Okay, Tony, that's interesting and it's very informative.
Thank you for listening to another Asian Agribiz podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts.